welcome back to The Empire Never Ended, where we do episodes that talk about episodes that we do.
Yeah, that's
Boris, Fritz, and Ray.
I think we should stop calling them. For a while, we were saying like mid-arc, and then it would definitely not be even close to mid.
No.
Because we end up
I don't want
doing
to
a lot
curse
more
it either.
episodes. No,
I don't want to call it like the first fifth.
so it's just be a recap of the previous episodes. People have,
I was calling it a semester.
yes,
Semester in review, because this is going to feel like a class.
Ugh.
But one of the fun ones, you know, with the popular teachers.
Yeah.
The worst ones. The worst one.
Yeah. So what are we doing, Fritz, exactly? You're guiding us through now this episode.
I prefer to think of it as you guiding me through this
Okay.
entire arc up till now.
Oh.
I went back, listened to everything, and took a bunch of notes, put it in a big old outline, and I think we need a review. I mean, like, it's a complicated story. I think listeners need it.
Yeah.
And I think as we move forward, it'll be pretty nice to just have to reference this episode, unless you want, like, the good meat. You know, the tender cuts are in the real episodes.
Yes.
But if you just need to remember, oh, who the fuck is this? When was that? Hopefully this episode will help you out.
Yeah, I mean, we've had listeners in the past say that, actually ask for kind of recaps because we sometimes throw a lot of information out in episodes and it can get confusing.
Yeah.
Especially as it builds.
And especially when you're dealing with, like, you know, secret organizations tied to, like, multiple other secret organizations or intelligence agencies or state powers, or on the other hand, like the distinctions between different left-wing anarchist socialist groups in the U.S., you know, and where these went. It's a lot. It's just a lot. So today we're gonna break it down.
Yeah, I'm looking at your notes. It's fucking nuts.
It's really nuts. Yes, I sent my notes. You'll notice a lot of question marks here and there, but I'm hoping you guys can jump in and fill in blanks as we go.
It doesn't feel like it was that long ago, but now that I'm looking at this, we've covered a fair bit
Shit
so
ton.
far. I mean,
Yes.
goddamn.
Yeah. And this is just to get it started. And then as I was, like, starting these notes, I started thinking, like, okay, how far back into Arc 2 do I have to go? And then I, you know, heard another voice in my head yell, don't do it at all. Don't do it at all.
Yes.
That was the point of Arc 2, you know? Yes, it does explain a lot of what we're going to talk about today, but no.
Arc 2 has
Yeah,
its own recaps too, right? It has two. There's a mid. There's a mid.
Did we do a mid-arc recap for Arc 2?
Or did we? I don't remember.
I don't
feel
think
like we did.
I don't know that we did. I think we finally learned that later, that trick.
You may be right.
I don't know. You know, we cover a lot of things on this show
Yeah.
in ridiculous amounts of depth. As a listener,
And yet
I have to
sometimes it
say.
still feels surface level.
Yes, yeah.
Because at least when you're like writing some of the episodes or, you know, researching it, and then you realize that like the shit that you said on the episode is just scratching the surface and there's so much more. But, you know,
Yeah.
that would arcs would just be endless then. I mean, it was like
this
that,
show.
we had to cut off in the last arc. We had to cut off like pretty important things like Liberty Lobby
Yes.
and shit like that just because we lost our minds.
Yeah.
And, you know, couldn't do it
This show
anymore.
is an endless series of loose threads that
Yeah.
we just have to keep on moving past.
Yeah, I even read a whole book about Liberty Lobby, but I was like,
We didn't even use it. Yeah,
no.
couldn't.
But we will eventually.
Well, it came back right in this arc already.
Yep.
Yeah.
Liberty Lobby is still here,
And the Birchers will come back.
and the Birchers. Yep,
My
yep.
favorites.
But, oh boys, let's begin. Let's begin with, so I thought I could, you know, put it all together on the chalkboards and come up with some, you know, fun scripted narrative, but I would need another week at least for that.
Hmm.
And we just don't have it. So this is like live chalkboard.
Okay.
Yeah. So let's start.
I mean, you're a skilled teacher, Fritz. So I have confidence in you. You have more teaching experience than the two of us.
Yeah.
So you have your structure kind of has three main parts. Right?
Yeah, but let me first start with what it is this arc's about.
Okay.
Right? Yeah. So what the first part of this arc has done is establish the creation of a right wing or fascist Yugoslav diaspora in the U.S. And as we go forward, we're going to stick with those groups.
Yeah.
Yes.
So to get there, we chronologically started with national defense, the Serbian national defense. But yeah, I should explain how I divided this up, though.
Real quick, I would just like to be that kind of dude and say not just the U.S. We are mostly going to focus on the U.S., but Canada is going to play a very big role in this story, and it kind of already does, even back to like the national defense days. And I won't promise, but we will also talk about Syria and Australia and shit like that.
Can't wait to do that outline. All right. Let's just get through this one. God damn. All righty. So yeah. So the way that I kind of redivided, it's not a radical reorganization, but I figured vaguely chronological would be the way to go, starting with the national defense, the Serbian national defense, then having a section on the death of the socialist diaspora in the U.S. and then closing on sort of the return of these nationalist forces in America, where we move on to the next part of the arc.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so that's the outline. Everybody, get your chalk ready.
Okay.
There was a time, a different time, a simpler time, when the ideas of, let's say, Yugoslavia and Greater Serbia were not completely different. They occupied sort of a spectrum. Serbian identity itself was sort of more fluid and flexible. It was, what would you call it? Like BCS plus. So an example of this would be that even like Croatian nationalists at the time could be at the time supporters of the idea of Greater Serbia, because it didn't necessarily mean the same thing. But around 1902, we end up with a sort of guerrilla army division, I guess, called Komite in Macedonia, fighting against the Turkish occupation of Bulgaria. Is that about right?
Well, I mean, fighting against the Turkish state, basically.
Well, in their mind, right? Are they? Yeah. They're like thinking that they're liberators, I guess.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So this is happening in 1902. It's not huge as far as Macedonian military adventures go. They're not a big group, but they're there. And in 1903, something very dramatic happens in Belgrade, and the Obrenović dynasty is, I guess, they're straight up ended. Yeah. There's nothing from the Obrenović after this. They were ruling the Kingdom of Serbia up to this point, but a conspiracy of officers kills them and tosses them out the window in 1903.
Yeah.
Europe is pissed about this, especially Austria, UK, etc.
Obrenović dynasty was very pro-Austrian and tied Serbia really to Austrian politics and economy. So this was basically the reason to get rid of them.
Yeah.
So they were pro-Western reformers, okay?
Right. Yes. And because they were the pro-Western reformers, the classic pro-Western reformers, they were also very anti-democracy, I guess. Yes. Yeah. But with them gone, by the anti-Western reactionaries, elections occur, and power goes back and forth for the next few years between the Nationalist Conservative Radical Party, embodied best by Nikola Pasic, and the left to liberal Independent Radical Party. Yeah. And between these two, you end up with like 18 governments before the First World War. And in this time, while Pasic is Minister for Foreign Affairs, I think that was still the name of it then, Komite, working in Macedonia, now falls under the control of the state. Before although they were like autonomous.
So these are
ostensibly autonomous.
Basically true. Although I would say that the Chetniks or the Komite in Macedonia, there were different kinds. Most of them were like attached to the VMRO movement that we talked about, which was like pro-Bulgarian, but also for some kind of Macedonian autonomy or even statehood in the Balkans. But now the ones that you are talking about are the Serbian Chetniks and Komites, who were organized a bit later. So the VMRO one existed already in the 19th century, basically, or the pro-Bulgarian ones. And then in the beginning of the 20th century, which is what you're talking about, there is a pro-Serbian version of that, kind of inspired by that, but with Serbian nationalist politics.
Right.
First as a private initiative, and then now exactly what you're saying, they become basically organized by the state.
Okay. And they named themselves Serbian Defense. The idea being the liberation of all Serbs under Turkish occupation. That's the idea. But again, what does Serb mean in this time? It could probably be pretty flexible up to this point, right? We still don't have that kind of hardline definition yet, do we?
No.
Well,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, with nationalist politics, it's always like basically can change.
Yes. Yeah.
Depending on what, the ruling class sees as its interest at the time.
And one of its interests was, well, pigs, which was unfortunate because Austria kicked off the pig war. I think it's also called the Customs War, which lasted
Pig
from
war is
1906 to
better.
1908. Pig war is great.
Not an actual war. It's like
Not an actual war. It's like a trade war
yeah.
that, as I understand it, came
It's like
from...
the Phantom Menace, right?
It's just like the Phantom Menace. Yes.
Damn, I have not seen the Phantom Menace more than once.
Well,
to be able to
very
get
stupid.
that reference.
I think people will get that reference as much as they get the idea of the pig war. I think.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a
Neither
blockade
of
of
those things
a
were
whole
very
planet
interesting.
there.
Yeah. So, as far as I understand it, Serbia at the time begins importing French munitions. Austria wants them to buy from Skoda, buy cannons and whatnot. And in retaliation, I guess, but really as a way to reinforce their stranglehold on the Serbian economy at the time, of which they control something like 90%, right?
Yeah.
Of imports coming from Serbia. They put this huge embargo on pigs, especially from Serbia, and which is very aggressive. And in this time, Serbia then begins to make new friends with, let's say, with Germany, not Austria, obviously, Germany, the UK, France, etc. In that time, during this trade war, you also have a lot of activity with socialists and anarchists, particularly in Belgrade. Example being the 1907 sugar factory strike, which was an illegal strike that the Social Democrats were not super into because they were wanting to encourage more foreign investment from, I guess, their new friends that they were trying to make out there in the world. And this is at a time of a lot of labor agitation. And the flip side of that is the kind of right-wing response to that agitation, which includes like thugs beating up workers, shooting people, stuff like that. There's, street battles and whatnot.
And they are also, those thugs are also Chetniks or Komites. So they are not only used for this guerrilla warfare in this nationalist attempt in Macedonia and in Kosovo, but also for this purpose.
Right.
Yeah. And one of those fancy fellas was a guy named Kosta Pachanac, who was one of the old Chetniks. He was one of these thugs, but eventually he became a member of Oryuna and a fascist collaborator, as well as a fascist himself.
Yeah, and collaborated closely with Jafar Deva, who we talked about a few episodes ago, who later became a CIA asset in the 1950s.
God damn, I didn't even put Jafar Deva in this thing. All right, well, there he is.
Fucking up, Fritz, come on.
He's in there. Okay, so in 1908, Austria makes a very unpopular move and annexes Bosnia, and Serbian defense, which had existed in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, now becomes National Defense, which, as I remember from the episode, was disguised mostly as an organic popular movement that was there to resist the annexation.
This organization, when it existed as the Serbian Defense, it was not a public organization. It was like a basically a secret organization run by the state to organize like espionage and guerrilla activity in Kosovo and Macedonia, the parts of the still Ottoman Empire that Serbia was interested in. And now the focus kind of changes towards Austria because of this move, annexing Bosnia, and it becomes a public organization that's doing like a campaign and organizing demonstrations and gathering money and help for Serbs in Bosnia and so on.
So one of the founders of National Defense was a guy who's very important named Jovan Docic, who will refound the Serbian National Defense in the U.S. much later in 1941, which we'll come to in more detail in a bit.
Yeah, Jovan Docic is a diplomat, but he's also a very hardcore Serbian nationalist. And a poet. He's mostly known as a poet, but very, very right-wing.
Celebrated poet, not as well remembered for his fascist politics. that the communists in the U.S. called him the Serbian phalangists.
Fun how that works out.
Yeah.
So, the National Defense, operating now in Bosnia, is recruiting volunteers for Chetnik detachments that are built from the sort of Komite experiences in Macedonia. Chetniks are also, however, beyond being like kind of guerrilla forces in the waiting, are integrated into the state at some level, taking like maybe low-level state jobs, cops, administrators, whatever, getting paid to be Chetniks, and causing some embarrassment because of it, because they're openly demanding pay, let's say, at some government office, threatening violence in full view of the Austrian embassy, which is a bit of an embarrassment because they're supposed to be a popular movement, not directed by the state. In 1909, part of the negotiations that go on then between Austria and Serbia include the disarming of the National Defense in Bosnia, but it remains as a cultural association continuing to do clandestine shit. But for who? And I think that's where we have to bring in the Black Hand. They don't like take it over immediately. And in fact, they never fully take it over as I understand it. But eventually these guys from the original coup, the Regid Defenestration of the Obrenovici, they do end up taking positions in state power that put them in some control over national defense. Okay.
Yeah, because eventually, all the Western allies accept the annexation of Bosnia by Austria, and so does the Serbian government, which really disappoints the kind of hardcore nationalist element in Serbia. And those are the people that you're talking about, the ones who killed the king and queen in 1903, and now they're pissed off that, the Serbian government is accepting this. So they basically decide to organize their own kind of center of power independent of the government, which becomes the Black Hand organization, and they try to control as much as they can. It's a secret group, but they have, for example, their guy becomes the general secretary of the National Defense Organization, and so I think they basically kind of create a parallel structure inside of it and are able to use the channels formed by the national defense for their own thing without the knowledge of the government.
Mm-hmm. Or at least with only partial knowledge, because we also know that Pashic seemed to have known kind of what was up. Am I wrong?
Yeah, because so basically, national defense is a kind of a network of agents, basically, that exist in Serbia and outside of Serbia, in Bosnia and Macedonia and so on. So these people, they have instructions, and there are ways for them to recognize other agents of national defense and help them when they need help. There are codes, messages being passed over, military equipment, explosives, guns, so on. But they don't necessarily ask, okay, who are you? Why are you here? What are you doing? Mm-hmm. Because this is all clandestine activity. So if you're able somehow to tap into that structure, if you know the codes and everything, you are able to use it. And I think that's how the Black Hand is using that. They're sending their own people, and people who are providing safe houses and so on maybe think, okay, these people are sent by the Serbian state or something like this.
Mm-hmm.
But they are able to communicate back to their people, in Serbia. I say, okay, some people, cross the border today and so on. So this is how also the communication, this knowledge of what's going on goes back to the government. So they are kind of aware that some people are doing something, but they don't necessarily always know why, if they are instructed by the Black Hand. This is like my idea of how this works.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So they have a network that passes through several places, including national defense, but also increasingly including the Serbian government as time goes on here. But they were already very much within the military, and that comes, of course, from the officer corps that killed the Obrenovici, and the Unity or Death, which we like to call the Black Hand, forms in 1911 officially. But I think we had, or Ray, maybe you had read some indications that at least they were talking about it as early as 1909 after these negotiations with Austria.
Well,
right?
For sure they existed in some informal form before that.
Yeah.
It's unification or death, or better known as Black Hand.
Unification or death. All right. Yeah. So the Black Hand, as far as we've seen, does a lot of sort of it keeps tension up in the state. Lots of crazy activities and threatening dudes and stuff like that. But it's centered around sort of the hero of this part of the arc, the villain. It's always the same thing, I guess, for us. But that is Dragutin Dimitrievich, who is also known as Apis, meaning the bee, who is the leader of the Black Hand, and he comes out of the military, and also does teaches at military academies and stuff like that. He's a well-established figure, though he's not an official in the government. He's a gray eminence kind of behind the curtain.
Although at some point he becomes the head of military intelligence. So
right.
He actually gets a very important position.
For a little while. We'll get to what happens to him.
Yeah.
In a bit.
The Black Hand is very serious about being a secret organization. They are that in a very formal sense, kind of inspired by the 19th century paramasonic nationalist groups like the Carbonari in Italy and so on. So they have rituals and, people with black hoods and daggers and knives and guns and oaths and such things.
So it's literally a cloak and dagger organization.
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, they have a symbol that has a dagger in it, a gun, a bomb, and a bottle of poison. I think that's their emblem.
Right. The Ustasha one has something similar, right? It's a dagger, pistol.
Yes. I think both
grenade.
the Ustasha thing and this one is kind of inspired by the Macedonians, really, the Vomero, in that sense.
The originals.
Yeah.
So something between Vomero and the Carbonari, I guess.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. All right. So, meanwhile, you've got a bunch of disaffected, young, kind of nihilistic types suffering from various illnesses in Bosnia, with a lot of different ideas, ranging from Bakunin to Nietzsche to Marx, but veering nationalistic.
Yes.
Is that fair to say? And this is called Young Bosnia.
Well, so you can, nationalistic in the kind of traditional
anti-imperialist
national
reaction
liberation
kind of
way.
Yes.
Kind of
but
familiar.
with different socialist, anarchist influences, but predominantly a nationalist, they see themselves as maybe national revolutionaries, anti-imperialists, but also very much into what was, interesting for young kind of bohemian intellectuals of the day. They're very much into Nietzsche. Most of them know German. So they read the books that come from Austria. They read all the time. The young Bosnia guys were fanatical readers. They were reading walking in the street and all the time, basically, all about books. So, and Young Bosnia was never a formal organization. It's more like a name for almost like a subculture or a movement of boys, basically, in Bosnia who had their own secret groups in high schools mostly. So most most high schools, which there was not a lot of them in Bosnia, which is one of the problems. Like people kind of felt, especially Orthodox population, they felt that the Austrian rule in Bosnia was really, really kind of unjust and harsh and, colonial. Also because they maintained the old feudal system. And most of these kids who were part of the Young Bosnia movement came from the kind of serf background, basically. And what was different about them from the older generations was they were getting like education. They were students. They were, most of them were students. Some went to Vienna, some to Graz, some to Prague, some to Belgrade, some to Zagreb. So they were getting some kind of education, and they were meeting other kind of like-minded people from other parts of Europe and sharing these ideas about basically destroying the Austrian Empire.
And into that mix comes a guy who I wrote the word lunatic next to, named Vojvode Tankosic. Tankosic is Black Hand, right? He's Unification or Death.
Yes.
And he begins to work with some of these young people in young Bosnia, planning the assassination of Franz Ferdinand.
So Tankosic, he's like right-hand man of Apis, the leader of Unification or Death. He's also a military officer, and he's like one of the main organizers of Chetniks in Macedonia, and like a war leader of Chetniks there, like known for personally killing deserters and such things. Very harsh commander and kind of fanatical, known to threaten the ministers in government and openly in the street and things like that. And he's also the organizer of training camps for Chetnik.
I had this note here that I was confused about. I think you had also mentioned that at some point he was negotiating with Albania and Turkey against Austria.
Not this. There was some communication between them and because Macedonia had like a lot of guerrilla activity there. Albanian, Bulgarian, Serbian, and also some like Turkish irregular troops there who were not supporting the government in Istanbul. So at some point there were like some negotiations specifically with Albanian groups, maybe even Turkish. I don't remember that. But yeah, that's true.
Which is interesting because of what the Chetniks will end up doing in the Balkan Wars to Albanians in particular.
Yes.
But I guess it could have gone another way. Who knows? And
that's how that shit usually goes now.
Yeah. It's just one fucking thing after another. Among those young Bosnians was a guy named Mustafa Golubic, who I am just going to say, check out that episode. That's its own story. That's his life alone is too complicated for an outline.
Download the Golubic DLC and
yes, download the Golubic DLC. Yes.
Yeah, Mustafa Golubic kind of ideologically went into the opposite direction of the guys that we are mostly concentrating in this arc, but had some of the same origin as they did. Like a young Bosnia guy who was recruited, basically through these Serbia defense channels, became a Chetnik, was fighting as a Chetnik in the Balkan Wars, in the First World War, also became a member of the Black Hand, and on behalf of the Black Hand was involved in assassinations, and he claims even that he was one of the organizers of the Franz Ferdinand assassination and so on. But then towards the end of the war became a communist, and that's a whole other career for him. Until he was killed in 1941 by Nazis in Belgrade. But had a kind of a spectacular career as also like an agent for the communist revolution or the Soviet Union in before that.
Yes. So the Black Hand at its height, I think this was maybe a number that was rumored to be true, but we weren't sure about it. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it was about 2,500 people that would somehow identify as Black Hand. I guess if they ask each other, I don't know where that number would come from, but we said something like that in the arc.
Possibly, yeah. I don't exactly remember, but there was some. It was like never completely determined how many members they had because only a few partial, like membership lists were found, and it is presumed that most of them were destroyed, the list.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But Mustafa
Admirable,
Golubic did say, sorry, go on.
Sorry,
Yeah.
no, admirable security culture compared to many other groups we talk about on this show in general.
Yes. Very different tier here.
Yeah.
I think it was Mustafa Golubic in his interview with the, was it NKVD, that he said, I, like everyone else in young Bosnia, joined the Black Hand, something like this.
He did say that, yeah. Although it's a bit difficult, like, because as we just explained, Young Bosnia was not a membership organization.
Yes,
it was like a movement. So, like, what does that even mean? But he probably means like the more prominent people who were involved in, things such as, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand and so on.
Yeah. At the same time, National Defense could boast hundreds of thousands of members. Quite a large organization. Now, I got a little confused here, and I was hoping you could help me out. So, Chupa and Slovenski Jug, as well as the magazine Piedmont, was Piedmont Slovenski Jug's Piedmont was fuck me, what am I gonna do? Piedmont. Was that out of Slovenski Jug? Because Piedmont was a Black Hand publication, right? In 1911.
Yeah. So Slovenski Jug was a magazine published by this guy Chupa before the Black Hand, formally started existing, and it was a kind of a counterpart, basically, to Young Bosnia types in Serbia. Chupa was like a leader of the student movement that was against King Alexander Obrenović, and that kind of a guy, like not a military guy, but like a kind of a revolutionary nationalist, as he saw himself, and was in contact with people like Young Bosnia abroad. And then he became, together with Apis, one of the organizers and one of the founders of the Black Hand, and he's the guy who kind of studied the older secret societies of Europe and was inspired by them and used that knowledge in starting the Black Hand. And then when Black Hand was organized, they made their own publication, which is, of course, officially not theirs because they officially didn't exist. But this was this magazine called Piedmont, the newspaper, called so after an Italian state that was seen as the state that, led the unification of Italy. So they saw Serbia in such a way, like as a state in the Balkans that will lead the unification of other Serbian lands or Yugoslav lands. As we know, this, like, Apis, just before he died, for example, he said, "Long live Greater Serbia, long live Yugoslavia." So for him, it was kind of the same thing, basically.
And they also had a kind of proto-fascist take on what a state should look like, having sort of a kind of a mix of corporatism and a cult of the state.
Yeah, they openly advocated some kind of a cult of the state, and
this is quite early.
You were like kind of for some kind of a centralized authoritarian rule, not
cross-class associations.
Yes, and not big fans of like civil liberties and such things.
Yeah.
So interestingly, also kind of develops along the Italian line there.
Yeah. Apis is later executed at the end of the First World War, ostensibly for plotting to kill King Alexander, but I think in our reading of it, it was probably something more like responsibility for the murder of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and probably under pressure from Austria now at the close of the war.
Well, I mean, yeah, we kind of skipped over the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, but yes, we didn't really talk about that. We didn't focus on it, but yeah, obviously it was done by Young Bosnia people who were the ones who kind of went through the Chetnik training of Tankosic and the Black Hand, and some of them apparently were even members of the Black Hand, for maybe all of them, we don't know exactly. So, the big question was always how much was the Serbian state aware that they will do this or not. From what I saw and what we read, it seems that it was really kind of organized by the Black Hand independently of the Serbian state, and there was some evidence that Pasic, he heard from these national defense agents who helped the young Bosnian people, uh, cross the border and go where they're supposed to go. That happened, that these people crossed the border, that they have some equipment and so on, and that Pasic maybe even tried to stop them before they killed Franz Ferdinand. It's not completely clear, but that's how it seems to me. That was like the event that triggered the invasion of Austro-Hungary of Serbia and the start of the First World War. There was before that there was an ultimatum by Austria to Serbia that basically demanded of Serbia that Austrian police and agents come to Serbia and be a part of the actual investigation of who killed and organized the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. But it's also interesting that one of the maybe first or second point in that ultimatum was that the National Defense Organization should be banned. So they explicitly mentioned that group as responsible. Of course, that didn't happen. Austria invaded, and basically the Serbian government went with the military and large parts of the part of the population in exile through Albania on foot, basically, and into Greece, into the Thessaloniki area, where they formed a new front, the Thessaloniki Front. And during that time, they decided that they need to get rid of these Black Hand people, that they're too, unreliable and dangerous people, and they accused them of plotting to kill Regent Alexander, the future king, and they were arrested, and Apis was executed. There are different versions why exactly was that done, but a part of the reason is probably they were kind of embarrassed by the whole Franz Ferdinand assassination. They were maybe even trying to make some kind of a peace settlement with Austro-Hungary at the time. Also, the Western allies were not really big fans of, assassinating emperors and kings and so on.
Yeah.
And also, these people were pretty crazy. They already killed one Serbian king. They now killed, the Austrian emperor. And from what we know, from what Mustafa Golubic wrote, they were kind of planning to kill a bunch of other kings and emperors.
Yes.
Including the Serbian one. So they needed to get rid of them.
And I mean, you also have to think about the position that the Serbian state found itself at this point, which is completely in exile, having, as you said, literally fled on foot.
Yeah.
And, suffered enormous casualties in the year-long process of being overrun by Austria.
Let's keep it going. Woo!
All right.
So there was, in this time, at least one Black Hand member that made it to the U.S., and that was a guy named Milan Ciganovic, who was a core member of Black Hand National Defense and also part of the Young Bosnia movement.
And according to Mustafa Golubic, the guy who kind of betrayed them to the government.
Uh-huh. Well, he ended up in the U.S. during World War I.
Yes.
And in 1914, at the same time, the Serbian National Defense was founded in New York. And I'm getting a little fuzzy here, but I remember we talked a lot about Mike Pupin, Mikhail Pupin, as one of the founders, was celebrated scientific figure, co-founder of what would eventually become NASA.
He was the president of the Serbian National Defense in America during the First World War, which explicitly was started as a kind of an offshoot of national defense.
And that had considerable success, like recruiting the diaspora to go fight in World War I.
Yes, in the Thessaloniki Front, and which they did quite successfully, I think.
Yeah, several thousand people went.
Yeah.
So the mix, it's basically a lobbyist group at this point.
Yeah.
That's about it.
So we kind of really skipped a lot of a few decades here because they're not super important. So the Black Hand officially is dissolved; it doesn't exist. But because it was a secret organization, you don't really know who were exactly the members and what they did after the organization was officially dissolved. So their leader was killed; they were dissolved. The war ended with a Serbian victory, let's say, and Yugoslavia was formed, the monarchist Yugoslavia. But former members of the Black Hand were, and suspected former members were still active in the 20s and 30s. We know that, and some of them had there were connections between them in different areas, of activity. So one example is Mustafa Golubic that we talked about, who worked with other former Black Hand members who kind of became communists and went in that political direction. But he maintained those relations, with former Black Hand members, and was even recommending to the Soviets that they should rely more on the Black Hand, organization or former members or whatever you want to call it in their activities. And he also was one of the people who was in the communist movement on the European level, kind of in charge and with setting up this national liberation type of groups. And for example, one of the things they did was they set up a leftist pro-communist version of VMRO at the time, because VMRO became a kind of basically a fascist organization and had connections with the Ustasha movement. So there was a parallel group to it, which was pro-communist. And Mustafa Golubic was involved in that. On the other hand, you had former Black Hand members who remained kind of right-wing and close to the centers of power in Yugoslavia. And we talked about a little bit about some of those types of former Black Hand members or possible members or associates of APIS in the episode when we discussed the beginning of the Second World War in Yugoslavia, which was, started with the Nazi invasion of Yugoslavia, basically the disappearance of the Yugoslav monarchy, because different areas of it were occupied by different powers. And this time, this invasion of Yugoslavia was triggered by another event that has some Black Hand connections. The First World War started, it was triggered by the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. This time, the triggering event is the coup and the demonstrations of the 27th of March 1941, which was the reaction of the Yugoslav government signing the tripartite agreement with the Axis powers, which is a very unpopular move. And there was view by some people that this was a similar situation to the situation at the beginning of the First World War, when when Serbia was dominated by Austro-Hungary. Some people see that now the Third Reich is in a similar way dominating Yugoslavia, and they want to get out of that situation and have a closer relation with the Western allies and with the Soviet Union. And at that point, there were no diplomatic relations between the Kingdom of Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, and they're quickly established, I think, in 1940. And the guy who becomes the first ambassador to Moscow is Milan Gavrilović, also a former member of the Black Hand. And his kind of close associate and to some degree mentor is Slobodan Jovanović, at that time a university professor and kind of ideologue of, let's say, liberal nationalism in Yugoslavia. And they are close associates. Jovanović was also a very good friend of Apis and his supporter, possibly maybe a Black Hand member, we don't know. And we know that through some memoirs and so on, that together these two guys, and specifically Slobodan Jovanović, at the end of the 30s formed another secret society, secret group that involved former members of the Black Hand. And their politics was this kind of anti-Axis politics and trying to forge relations between Yugoslavia and the Western allies on one hand, on the Soviet Union on the other, and trying to prevent Yugoslavia joining the disagreement with the Axis powers. So this secret society was called Conspiracies, and it was inspired by the Black Hand, and in some way maybe a continuation of it, because it, as I said, had members who were directly involved in the Black Hand. So the question is, how much was this secret society group kind of involved in preparing the coup of the 27th of March? According to some, it was their coup. According to others, it was not. But yeah, for sure, they were very much involved in it.
All right. So what was the situation when Serbian National Defense was formed in 1914, and then again later in 41. What did the sort of Yugoslav diaspora look like in the States? And we talked about in the early part of this arc sort of the socialist, anarchist, maybe broadly speaking, left Yugoslav diaspora in the U.S., because there was a massive population of Slavic workers, especially in the sort of steel heart of America, as
steel
Kwok
and
will
coal
call it later. Yeah,
coal country and stuff. Yeah,
and you also had a long history of mutual aid societies popping up. I think we said the first of these was a Slovenian one that had figured out how to drink because of prohibition.
That was a little bit later, yeah, but the Slovenes had the first kind of national organizations, which largely had a kind of socialist character in its various meanings in the early days, and even I think their national groups tended to stay largely in that kind of broadly left category.
Mm-hmm.
Including founding their own town so that they could, get liquor licenses and drink.
What was the name of that fucking town? It was like
the name of the town is the acronym. It's known as one of the few places in the U.S. that's an acronym. So the name of it's like a census designated place. It's not even like a town. It's like a village. It's called SNJP.
Yes, SNJP, the village. Yeah, It's a village that is a bar.
No, SNPJ, right? It's
not a great town name. That's the point.
No,
but we
doesn't roll off the tongue.
And this was important for us to look at. We spent some time looking at kind of working class diaspora culture in the U.S. We talked about like the Joe Magarac mythology and sort of the culture around like the sort of Tamburitzin sketch comedy, essentially to show that what you had here was not like a neat division of nationalist Serbs, nationalist Croats, nationalist Slovenians, whatever. You had a sort of South Slavic American, not necessarily well-defined culture, but I guess that's also kind of the point. And it ran through not only cultural associations, but also through like worker organizations, socialist groups, etc.
Yeah. In the early days, you had the South Slavic Federation of Labor and the various different offshoots of like the Americans, like Socialist Party and the like, that were broadly these like language organizations for South Slavic people. And those kind of formed the model for what would later become the United Committee during World War II, which was, pretty influential.
But then maybe before getting to that, we could briefly look at some of the kind of socialist and worker activity that was going on. Importantly, organizations like, or papers rather, like the Free Word.
Yeah, so I mean, like organizations like it's newspapers, and kind of broadly you can call them organizations because there was kind of a movement that surrounded them more so than like just the actual physical papers and printing presses or whatever. Those are important to our story because they were the direct enemies of groups like Serbian National Defense, to the point that like Serbian National Defense still talks about it, even though they've long been forgotten by pretty much everybody else in the world.
I think also they made up an enormous part of that social ecosystem.
Yes,
I think as well.
And those are the kind of the papers that came out of this long tradition of left-wing like printing in like South Slavic languages, in that they used to they followed the splits that existed in some of these organizations. So once the Socialist Party kind of fell apart after World War I, some of the newspapers were dissolved and then started, they started other ones. And then, we have our famous De Leonists who were big for a while, et cetera, et cetera. And the Free Word and the People's Herald, which is the Croatian one, are organs of essentially the Communist Party of the USA.
which was majority Yugoslav at that point.
Yeah, which at some point, it's at like certain points in its existence had a significant portion of its membership being South Slavic, which is why they got kind of disproportionate amount of attention given to them by like the state later, and had quite a bit of influence.
And also a lot of attention from the Comintern. And we talked about Mirko Markovic as sort of one of their men in the Free Word, the Serbian paper.
He was editor of the Free Word. He was sent by the Comintern to restructure the party, the Yugoslav diaspora, into separate national organizations to reflect the Soviet Union's nationalities policy, which was a very unpopular move. But Markovic was a really kind of skilled organizer, and despite, doing some pretty unpopular things, was able to get a lot of stuff off the ground and was ultimately kind of pretty popular in those circles. Seemed to be kind of a charismatic guy. He fought in the Spanish Civil War, was a commissar in the George Washington Battalion, also responsible for getting volunteers from the United States to go fight in the Spanish Civil War and like. The Comintern did dedicate a disproportionate amount of attention to South Slavs in America because they made up such a large part of the party. And so I think next to Markovic, the Comintern only sent one other like direct agent to work within kind of Russian-speaking communities in the U.S. Because they had a huge kind of white and nationalist character in the U.S. And they wanted to kind of switch that over. Mm-hmm. So yeah, Markovic and a couple other guys who would later, were from, say, like the Croatian American community, would later go to Moscow and be trained in the party schools and the like and come back. People like Stjepan Loyan, who we talked about a little bit, and some others as well.
And these socialist South Slavic papers, groups, people, as well as people that weren't necessarily actively organizing with them, came under a larger group. Well, a couple, but one of them was the American Slavic Congress. And this was a truly massive organization that was looked upon at first favorably by the Roosevelt administration and people like Henry Wallace, but the tide turned very quickly at the end of the war and in the post-war period, where they were seen as a sort of subversive communist threat in the heart of America's steel land, ready at any minute to pull the trigger in any number of sabotages and conspiracies of all sorts to favor the Soviet Union. In fact, their leader, who I think we can just say is George Perinsky, as far as like the central figure here, was towards the end of the war calling for strikes. There were massive strikes in the 45, 46 period.
Yeah.
And
some of the largest strikes in U.S. history.
Yes. Yeah. And Perinsky was in particular seen as like a central, correctly seen as a central firebrand. And he would also draw attention to like the CIA Act being passed in 49, Public Law 10, I guess, as well as raise the alarm early on of rescued fascists and collaborators, etc., coming into the U.S.
Yeah, who are at this point starting to kind of flood in.
Yeah,
and change the kind of landscape of these emigre communities, which is why I wanted to talk about it in the first place, because it's a very marked kind of point in the history of those communities.
Yeah, and the people that end up taking over a lot of these organizations or creating these new ones, which become dominant, have kind of erased all of this. They would like to pretend that all these organizations were always some kind of highly nationalist, separatist, monarchist group, and it just isn't the case. And the Croatian Fraternal Union being an important example of that, which was, and this is Boris, tell me if I'm wrong, but the largest and oldest Croatian Mutual Aid Society?
It is still the largest and oldest Croatian like ethnic organization and mutual aid society. I think outside of Croatia. It was founded in the 19th century and kind of remained a big tent organization throughout most of its existence, although at various different times had leadership that was either more or less nationalistic or separatist or whatever.
I think you mentioned that
they're one of the rare exceptions to, for example, like after World War II, the longtime head who came in there, I think in like 47 or 48, like really quickly after the war, was very pro-Yugoslav oriented, and so that changed. Like the character of the Croatian Fraternal Union remained very pro-Yugoslav until the 90s, basically. And it's still not as like, let's say, chauvinistic as like the Serbian National Federation, which never had that kind of sways in its leadership. It always kind of remained a steadfast like monarchist, or I guess they would vary between like hardcore monarchist and constitutional monarchy, but always with this kind of very Serbian nationalist character to it. They, of course, were at war with other Serbian organizations that weren't in that vein, but the Croatian Fraternal Union definitely had a lot more variety in its political opinions.
Mm-hmm. They also, as early as the 30s, had minority elements splintering off to make like Ustasha groups. Inside the states already.
Yeah.
And then I think you also mentioned, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there was again a sort of the reverberations of the Ustasha kind of took over for a while in the 60s as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, for the Croatian community, the arrival of right-wing emigres really drastically changed their, social and political landscape, because Ustashas were a pretty small minority, even during like in the 1930s when like Pavelić sent an actual like a high-ranking Ustasha guy to get the movement started there, and didn't have that much luck. He had luck in really conservative Catholic circles, large number of Croatian Catholic clergy were being investigated during World War II as being potentially like subversive, since, the independent state of Croatia was at war with the United States. But, in the 1950s, with the arrival of all the Ustashas, they have a very hard time in like, for the first time, you start getting this very, especially in certain cities and communities, a dominant kind of Ustasha presence.
Mm-hmm. And even the Ustasha activity in Yugoslavia had a big effect on the American Slavic organizations. The stories of atrocities began coming in 1941. And you got papers like the American Serbian Defender, which we'll get to in a second, saying that like all Croats are Ustasha,
Yeah, it was a mistake to trust the Croats, blah, blah, blah. They're basically evil agents of the Vatican.
Yeah. And meanwhile, you've got guys like Perinsky saying that, no, these guys are, I think they used the word traitors. They equated Ustasha to the American Serb Defender, that were denouncing them, as well as America First and the KKK, saying that it's not a national question.
Yeah, Marković made that. Marković made that connection explicitly.
That was Marković. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that like a real start or the dominance of that kind of politics, the anti-Yugoslav, happened with the arrival of Jovan Dučić in America in 1941.
Yeah.
When he refounded the Serbian National Defense in America.
Yeah, and with his brother Mike.
His cousin, I think.
Mike.
Yeah,
who that was kind of brother,
like a wealthy industrialist, and like a financier of the group. But so Dučić, who we mentioned as this diplomat, poet, extreme right-wing guy, it's interesting that he was one of the founders of the Regional National Defense in 1908. So now he restarts it in 41 in America. And base this really on this ideology how Yugoslavia was a mistake and a kind of a Croatian conspiracy against the Serbs. exactly like you now explained. He dies during the Second World War, but the organization basically still has the same politics.
Mhm.
And it's not insignificant that the diplomatic post that he left to come to the United States was in Franco's Spain. He was, the Yugoslav ambassador to Francoist Spain, who then had to leave because Spain recognized the independent state of Croatia. But he still, people say that he had a particular kind of affinity for Francoist kind of politics.
Yeah.
And for that was kind of his model.
And when he arrived to America, he claimed that he's on some kind of a mission by the Serbian or Yugoslav exiled government. Never really explained what the mission was, but we know that he restarted this organization and based it around this anti-Croatian, anti-Yugoslav ideology. And so the Serbian National Defense is very significant in America for this story because basically all of the terrorists that formed their groups in the 60s and 70s, the Serbian terrorists, were members of the Serbian National Defense. And this terrorist side of the Serbian right-wing diaspora came from the more extreme right-wing wing of the Serbian National Defense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's a very clear connection.
Yeah.
Yes. And even, people like the free word and in some of those circles kind of had predicted that earlier. They kind of knew that's exactly what Serbian National Defense was there to do.
And as we'll see, the groups that are formed kind of openly and very clearly were inspired by the Black Hand and APIS and frequently would mention them as a model.
As well as, I believe, had probable direct connections, right?
Well, yeah, that's what I kind of speculate on. But for example, Milan Gavrilović was a direct connection. He was kind of an advisor to the founders of the group SOPO, that we will talk about in much more detail. Yeah, and also they claimed that they followed the ideology set by Slobodan Drašković, who was a member of the secret group Conspiracies, allegedly, and whose father was a member of the Black Hand and was assassinated in 1921 by the communists because he was the Minister of Interior who persecuted the communists in Yugoslavia. Yeah. So there is that kind of a connection there. And it's interesting that, the Slobodan Drašković, who, was kind of the main ideologue of the people who went into this terrorist direction and restarted basically a version of the Black Hand in the diaspora, that he was also a member of the John Birch Society and connected to all kinds of American fascists.
So we also had the churches, and they're a big deal here. We talked a second ago a little bit about how Catholic connections helped in the Ustasha, what spread in America, but we really need to talk about the Serbian Orthodox Church for a minute. Yeah. Because we also found out that it was not totally uncommon to have like pro-worker, socialist sympathetic priests, some of them just outright socialists, communists.
Outright communists, yeah.
Yeah. And these included guys like Strahinja Maletic, who during the war was doing his best to sort of stop this oversimplification of things into nationalist animosity and not willing to say that, all Croats are Ustaša or whatever. And he was denounced by a fellow we're going to talk about now named Dionisie, a bishop. Dionisie.
And Strahinja Maletic was the Serbian representative to the American Slav Congress for most of its existence. And it cost him his position in the church as well. Yeah. He, like many of these other guys, were defrocked by the official church.
So early in this period, let's say in the 20s, we mentioned in the arc that Nikolai Velimirovic had done some tours in the States trying to organize the Serbian church there. But his protege, Bishop Dionisie, who was also part of some like millenarian kind of Orthodox cult, right, back in the homeland, he comes
Yeah,
by.
initially he was a kind of he said that had some heretical views, but then was set on the right path by Bishop Velimirovic that you just mentioned, and we have a whole episode on him. Who was a kind of a fascist bishop, and many of the bishops in the Serbian Orthodox Church had some fascist sympathies. Dionysia being one of them.
Yeah.
So Dionysia in 41 hosts this Vidovdan, what was it, like a conference of some kind in Libertyville, Illinois, right? And at this conference includes Arthur Bliss Lane, who has come up several times. He's an American congressman, I think, at this point, as well as Jovan Dučić.
Dionysia is also someone who connects these two histories that we talked about and will talk about. So Dionysia is, the enemy of Mirko Marković and the whole that history that we talked about. But later he's also directly connected with these right-wing terrorists, and he's a kind of a protege, like a kind of a mentor of theirs.
Yeah, and he's like really an anti-communist extremist to the point that like he splits off and then kind of does his own church, which is why he's important to the later story. But he's interesting because he comes to the U.S. around the same time as Dučić. A little bit, before, but, kind of at the beginning of World War II where things are really getting bad over in the homeland. And, he picked up where the previous bishop had left off, but was way more hardcore about it, and way more of like an explicit, nationalist and fascist, pretty much.
Yeah.
It was pretty clear because, when they consolidated the churches in the 1920s and formed a diocese for North America, there were many churches that didn't want, like Serbian-speaking churches that did not want to fall in line with the official patriarchate. And after, some kind of protracted legal conflicts and kind of spite churches and stuff that we talked about in those few episodes, they were able to consolidate most of like North American Serbian-speaking churches, and then Dionysia kind of takes it into a much more overtly right-wing direction with his arrival in 41 until his death.
And eventually he accuses the church in Belgrade being under the communist control, and this is the official reason why he separates and forms his own church on like this anti-communist basis. Although we mentioned there was like an interesting thing going on there, because initially why he got into trouble with the Serbian church was that he was accused of having like a lover. A woman was living on monastery properties, and he was like apparently buying her gifts and so on. And this is initially why he was like had a little kind of a church trial initiated by the church authorities in Belgrade, and then he accused of the church being under the control of the communists. Some right-wingers were saying how this woman was like herself was like kind of a communist, spy sent there to seduce the bishop and so on. Interestingly, she died just a few weeks ago.
Oh, really?
Her name was Radmila Milentijević. She was like a historian, and she was actually a minister in the like Milošević government, I think towards the end of the 90s.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right.
Interesting. I didn't know that she had just died. I had figured she was long gone.
So just to get back to this image of what's happening now to the diaspora, the left diaspora there in the States, you've got again now pressure coming up from like emigres, fascist emigres, nationalist emigres, as well as church organizations having their own struggle, going back as far as the 20s, against also socialist sympathetic elements in the church. All of this kind of slowly turning the diaspora rightward. And in the meantime, you've got the Vatican helping Catholics, put in scare quotes, escaping communism. Catholics eventually becomes anti-communists, escaping communism. And it's all led through our boy Draganović. Shit.
Yeah,
What's
I mean,
his
this
first
stuff
name?
should be still
Krunoslav.
Krunoslav. Yeah, this should
still
be
be
pretty
fresh.
fresh because this was pretty recently. I
Yeah,
mean,
so
yeah,
just keep in mind you got that happening too. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So this is all aided by the U.S. deep state, who has started the Bloodstone operation. I want to say that's 48, 49.
Yeah.
And this is, in short, again, this should be fairly fresh, but in this way, thousands and thousands of ex-collaborators and fascists are coming into the U.S. And by 1950, sort of George Kennan, who was more or less not running the whole thing necessarily officially, but in a lot of ways he was kind of the central point of all of this. He sort of loses control over what was barely the last like tiny remnants of rationality left, which he somehow naively held on to in this growing Third World War against the Soviet Union. He loses control entirely to people like Bliss Lane, who was again at that Vidovdan conference, and Dulles, et cetera, Nitz Weisner, all those guys. By 1950, essentially, the U.S. deep state has consolidated into a sort of Nazi-affiliated nuclear war machine, in a way, which is how we got John Wayne and the Green Berets. But you also have the more well-known part of that happening from the U.S. government, which is what we generally call McCarthyism, even that stuff leading up to McCarthy himself. And the American Slavic Congress by 45 and 46 is already being called treasonous, related to the strike wave. 1948 Subversive Activities Control Act passes, labeling the American Slavic Congress as a subversive element. Perinsky responds, calling for more strikes. The HUAC report that we did a whole episode on, it's the House Un-American Activities Committee report in 1949, comes out on the American Slavic Congress, basically again saying that they are a socialist sleeper cell, at the strategic heart of the country. Republished again in 51, just for kicks. And you had also organic-ish groups, like, organic, that's not even the right way to put it. You had, how would you call it? Like ostensibly organic groups like Americans Battling Communism, the ABC.
Right.
Going around doxing socialists, especially in these like...
I mean, they're vigilantes. That's what they are. It's anti-communist vigilantes.
Yeah.
And
guys like Matt Svedek, who we talked about,
but with
significant, got a whole day.
Sorry, with significant like state help. I mean, they are vigilantes that are doing what the state can't officially do and are affiliated with people in like, local government, for example, judges and, bureaucrats of different kinds. And they're the ones doing kind of the dirty work of like the doxing, the organizing, counter demos that turn into riots and that kind of thing.
Right. And so by the time you get to 51, the Free Word and the People's Herald are gone. And the last people left on the battlefield are these like fucking fasci people.
Yeah, and combined with significant also anti-union legislation that happens during this time period, the combined effects on that of, both anti-communist and anti-labor legislation really breaks the back of any kind of, as they called themselves, like progressive move elements within the diaspora, in that like they still continue to exist, but were really weakened. And of course, partly also because some of their leadership just went to Yugoslavia, and some of the more kind of really more radical guys were like, okay, well, there's socialism in Yugoslavia, now we're going to go. Yeah. And some of them went and came back, but most, a lot of people went over too, which is another forgotten too.
Which leads us to, I guess, where we currently are more or less in the arc, which is the afterlife of these groups in America. And to sort of close it off and lead into that, I think we should also emphasize certain points of connection in what we've already discussed. One of these would be the Serbian Church Committee for Serbian Displaced Persons. That's as Serbian as you can make the title of an organization.
Yes.
And I'm getting a little fuzzy here, so maybe Boris, you can help me out, but they were working in conjunction with the Serbian National Defense to bring essentially thousands of people in under, quote, blanket assurances, which was a license that they were given by U.S. law. And it's in this time you get guys like Jovan Dučić moving to Gary, Indiana. So I think the Serbian National Defense and these displaced persons committees, they unite in this time. Is that correct?
More or less, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
You also had guys who've already talked about, like Slobodan Drašković, who has a very weird kind of post-war story.
Yeah.
And this includes something, and again, now this is Ray to correct me, the British Civil Mixed Watchman Service. Is that right?
Yes, something like this, yeah. We mentioned it a few times.
And this was based out of a former Westphalian SS stronghold, in Drašković's case, run by British intelligence, in a very similar sort of vibe that the labor services would have later for U.S. intelligence.
I mean, I don't know what's the exact connection of Drašković to this, but he was living in this village in Germany where these Chetniks were based after the end of the Second World War, and who were recruited into this service organized by the British military, which is mentioned in the official history of the Serbian National Defense in America as a important part of their own history. So from there, those people were directed to. They migrated to United States through Serbian National Defense, who was closely working with the parts of the U.S. government on that project.
Yeah. And I think we had said that it's around that point that we can say what is probably left of the Black Hand meets the CIA in a common effort through the Serbian National Defense.
Well, maybe, or I would rather say that, Serbian National Defense as a inheritor of the original national defense, which, as its extreme kind of wing produced the Black Hand, now in a new context is, forging a relationship with the American deep state, and will soon produce a new kind of a terrorist wing, which is inspired by the Black Hand. So, you have the Serbian National Defense or National Defense in different eras producing their own terrorist groups, and the second one, the younger one, is inspired by the older one. So there is a kind of a organizational connection between the two groups, and clear, and in some also personal connection in the sense that some members of the original Black Hand are now connected to the new group in the form of advisors and so on.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. And then on the other hand, the reverberations of the sort of Ustaše emigres coming up through the rat lines and through Bloodstone, they will also go on to have their own Croatian nationalist terrorist groups.
Yeah.
In the 60s, 70s, 80s. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's pretty much it, right? I mean,
we did it.
We're up. That's where we are now.
Yes.
Yeah. Basically.
Whoa,
yeah.
Okay. Good fucking God. Word.
It's a lot, but I think it's good going into the next section of the arc to have a little reminder of things that we talked about before.
Yeah. All right. There we go.
Yeah.
So cool. Do I get like an A, or what do I get here? B plus?
That was A material. Gotta
A
say,
material.
You did a pretty good
I'll take it.
summary there.
Woo.
To the point that there was almost too much detail in the summary.
Yeah, but okay. It's not.
You're a grade A nerd.
Grade A Streber.
Yeah, this fucking.
I mean, in terms of length, it's pretty perfect for one episode. Hopefully, people will be able to follow it.
Well, I mean, it's either this or listen to the 15 hours of fucking podcasts that I listen to make it. So it's up to you, listener.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Any thing you guys noticed coming out of this after it's all together in one big story?
Well, we're missing the Ustašes. I'm afraid to say that.
Yeah, we haven't focused much on them yet.
That's gonna come up in the second part of the arc.
Right.
So I mean, we definitely talk a lot about national defense and the Black Hand and stuff. But that's definitely not all.
The Ustasha kind of prehistory is pretty covered in our second arc.
In arc 2, yeah.
Yeah.
As is the Chetnik movement.
Yeah. And we talked a little bit about the red lines already in this arc. So
yeah.
But the Black Hand and all that we didn't really get to cover in the second arc, so that completes our story here, I think.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Up to now. All right.
Yeah.
Damn, I'm ready now. I'm ready to stop talking about people from the fucking... And nobody from now on, right? Am I wrong? Nobody from now on was born in the 19th century.
No.
Yes.
I mean, Dionysia is like...
Dionysia.
Yeah, he will...
right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, but I got a handle on that motherfucker.
And I think Velimirovich until he buys the farm too, right?
Yeah.
It's like the old guys. But, they're going to die off.
Far too late.
Relatively... Yeah, far too late. But probably pretty early in the second part of the arc.
All right, guys. So we'll get this second part started, the week after next, right?
Yep, that sounds about right.
Take a little breather.
Yeah, you're traveling, so it's a bit difficult to do it straight away, but soon.
Yeah. And you give the listeners some time to digest and meditate on, how shitty everything got. And how, fucking inevitable it would be that we develop a very healthy fascist movement in the United States.
Yes.
So, all right. Good times, guys.
Cool. Yeah. All right. Later. See you soon. Bye.
Hey there, Fritz here from The Empire Never Ended. This has been one of our weekly free episodes for free people. But for premium people, we also have weekly premium episodes, which you can get at patreon.com/tenepod, TENEPOD, and also follow our various social media things in the show description there. Like and subscribe them. Follow them. Like and follow and subscribe. Follow them. Do it.